All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. We always love digging into the really meaty philosophical topics, and today is no exception. We're tackling a big one, something that's super fundamental to, like, how we even think about the mind at all, this idea of modularity of mind.
A real workhorse of a concept in philosophy of psychology, that's for sure.
Totally. And this one actually came straight from one of our awesome listeners, right?
That's right, yeah. They've flagged the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on modularity of mind. Clearly, they're as fascinated by this as we are.
Yeah, big shout out to that listener. Really appreciate you bringing this to our attention. So I guess our mission for today is pretty clear. We're going to try to unpack this whole concept of mental modules, look at all the different ways people have understood it.
Oh, and we definitely can't shy away from the controversy. We got to explore those philosophical battlegrounds that this idea has created.
You said it. It wouldn't be a deep dive without a bit of intellectual sparring. But of course, we're going to try to do all this without getting too bogged down in jargon.
Right. The goal is clarity and depth, but not at the expense of accessibility.
Exactly. So imagine you're sitting down with a fellow philosopher, cup of coffee in hand, and just having a really in-depth conversation about this crucial idea.
That's the vibe we're going for. And to really trace its evolution, understand where the key disagreements lie, we got to start at the beginning.
Okay, so where do we begin?
Well, this whole debate, really kicked off with Jerry Fodor back in the early 1980s.
Ah, Fodor. Always a good place to start a philosophical brawl. His book, The Modularity of Mind, was a major turning point in this whole area. Right?
Well, game changer. It set the terms of the debate for decades. So what was Fodor's big idea? What was he proposing about how the mind works?
Yeah, break it down for us. What was the essence of his argument?
Well, at its core, Fodor was saying that at least certain parts of the mind are organized into these distinct, specialized units, kind of like little mental organs, you could say. And he called them modules.
Modules, right. So these modules are like specialized processors, each handling a particular type of information.
Exactly. And he went on to give this really detailed list, actually 9 features that he thought characterized these modular systems.
9 features. Wow, he was really thorough. So what were these 9 features that made a mental process a module in Fodor's view?
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that for Fodor, you didn't need to check every single box on this list to qualify as a module. A system just needed to have most of these features,
Right.
and to a pretty significant degree.
Okay, so kind of a family resemblance sort of thing. Some modules might be more modular than others, depending on how many of these features they had.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But there were certain features that he considered more crucial, like informational encapsulation, which we'll get to.
Okay. Color me intrigued. So let's dive into these 9 features, or at least the ones that you think are the most philosophically interesting and important.
Sounds good. Where should we begin?
Well, you mentioned domain specificity earlier. I feel like that's got to be pretty central to the whole idea of a module, right?
You're absolutely right. Domain specificity is absolutely key. Basically, it means that a module is dedicated to processing a very narrow range of inputs, like a specialist in a very specific field.
Okay, so give us some examples. What kind of mental processes might count as domain specific in this sense?
Well, think about something like color perception. The ability to see and distinguish colors, that's a very specific domain, right?
Yeah, definitely. We're not talking about seeing in general, just this particular aspect of visual experience.
Right. Or consider the mechanisms involved in parsing the syntax of a sentence in language, figuring out the grammatical structure.
Okay, so the bit that tells us whether a sentence is grammatically well-formed, even if we don't consciously think about it?
Exactly. And then you've got things like face recognition, which also seems to be a very specific ability. These are all examples of domain-specific processes.
Right, so a dedicated module for face recognition, distinct from a general object recognition system, that makes sense as a starting point for a specialized unit.
Yeah, it's about carving up the mind into these specialized processors, each handling its own little piece of the cognitive puzzle.
So we've got these specialized modules, each responsible for its own domain. What's the next key feature on Fodor's list?
Well, the next one is mandatory operation. This means that when a module receives its specific type of input, it just kicks into gear automatically, involuntarily. You can't just decide to switch it off or prevent it from processing that information.
So it's like a reflex, kind of. You can't help but react in a certain way when you encounter a particular stimulus.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Like, think about a native English speaker hearing English being spoken.
Okay, yeah. I can't just decide to not understand English anymore, even if I wanted to.
Right. Your language processing module just automatically kicks in and starts parsing those sounds, extracting meaning. You don't consciously choose to do that.
Or think about our visual system. It just automatically constructs a 3D representation of the world from the 2D input on our retinas.
Exactly. And that's happening all the time, whether we're aware of it or not.
Okay, so it's an automatic, involuntary response to a specific type of information. You're not making a conscious decision to engage the module.
Precisely. Now, the next feature on Fodor's list is a bit more subtle, but I think it's really philosophically interesting. He called it limited central accessibility.
Okay, limited central accessibility. That sounds like a mouthful. What does that even mean?
Well, it's like this. While a module is busy doing its processing, the intermediate steps, the actual representational formats it uses, all that stuff is basically hidden from view. You don't have conscious access to it.
So it's kind of like a black box. We know the input and the output, but we're in the dark about what's going on inside.
Exactly. It's like you understand the meaning of a sentence, but you don't have any direct awareness of all the intricate phonological, lexical, syntactic computations that your brain went through to get to that understanding.
Right, I'm just aware of the final product, the meaning, not all the steps involved in generating it.
Yeah. And this idea of limited central accessibility is actually closely tied to another feature we'll discuss later, informational encapsulation. They're kind of two sides of the same coin.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that there are some really deep connections between these different features. But before we get to encapsulation, what about the speed of processing? Fodor talked about that too, right?
She did, yeah. Modular systems are generally thought to be pretty fast, much faster than those more deliberative central cognitive processes we were talking about earlier.
Okay, that makes sense. If they're specialized and automatic, they should be able to do their thing pretty quickly.
Right. Fodor often used a benchmark of like half a second or less.
Half a second, wow. So what kind of tasks would be that fast?
Well, think about how quickly you can repeat someone's words back to them.
Yeah.
That speech shadowing thing.
Ah, yeah. It's almost instantaneous.
Exactly. That suggests a very rapid processing of the incoming auditory information.
Okay, so we've covered domain specificity, mandatory operation, limited central accessibility, and fast processing. I'm ready for the big one you keep hinting at, informational encapsulation.
Ah, yes. This is the crown jewel of Fodorian modularity. It's the one that's generated the most debate and has all sorts of interesting implications.
Okay, I'm all ears. What exactly does it mean for a mental process to be informationally encapsulated?
It means that when a module is working on a specific piece of information, it can't access information stored elsewhere in the cognitive system. It's limited to its own input and its own little internal database.
So it's like a little isolated pocket of processing cut off from everything else that's going on in the mind.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. It's walled off, protected from outside interference.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's go back to the language parser.
Sure.
Fodor argued that when this module is trying to figure out the grammatical structure of a sentence, it's working solely based on the sounds and the rules of grammar. It can't use your general knowledge about the world or your expectations about what the sentence might mean to help it with the parsing.
So even if my general knowledge strongly suggests a particular grammatical structure, the language module initially just ignores that. It's working in a vacuum.
Exactly. It's encapsulated from all that extra knowledge.
That's a pretty radical claim. Are there other examples, like from other domains?
Oh yeah, there are tons. Think about visual illusions like the Muller-Lyer illusion.
The one with the lines that look different lengths even though they're actually the same?
Exactly. Even when, rationally that the lines are the same length, you still perceive them as different. Your visual module just can't help itself.
It's like the illusion persists despite my best efforts to overcome it.
Exactly. And that's a really strong argument for informational encapsulation. If our visual systems were constantly influenced by our beliefs and knowledge, we wouldn't experience illusions like that.
That's a really good point. Okay, so we've got encapsulation. What's next on the list?
All right, well, the next one is shallow outputs. This means that the output of a module is computationally cheap to produce and pretty general in terms of its informational content. It's not giving you some deep theoretical understanding of the world.
So it's giving you the basic building blocks for further processing, but not the whole picture.
Right. Think about visual object recognition again. Fodor thought the output of the visual module might be something like dog or chair, those basic level categories,
Yeah.
rather than some more complex concept like canine or furniture.
So the module gives you the label dog, but it doesn't tell you everything about what it means to be a dog.
Exactly. It's leaving the higher level interpretations to other parts of the mind.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the biological implementation of these modules? Did Fodor have anything to say about that?
Absolutely. He proposed that modules have a fixed neural architecture. This basically means that they're implemented in specific, dedicated neural circuitry in the brain.
So if we could peek inside the brain, we should be able to find a specific area that corresponds to, say, the language module or the face recognition module.
That's the idea. Although these areas don't necessarily have to be physically next to each other, they could be distributed throughout the brain.
Okay, so it's more about the functional connections than the physical proximity.
Right. All right, now we're getting to some of the features that are really closely tied to the empirical evidence for modularity.
Okay, hit me with it. What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, Fodor pointed to characteristic and specific breakdown patterns. This means that if a module gets damaged, you should see very specific cognitive impairments, while other functions remain intact.
Okay, so like if the face recognition module gets damaged, I might not be able to recognize faces anymore, but I can still see and understand language just fine.
Exactly. And there are lots of neurological syndromes that seem to fit this pattern, like prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces.
Or specific aphasias, where people lose certain aspects of language ability, but not others.
Precisely. These kinds of selective deficits following brain injury are often taken as evidence for the existence of functionally specialized modules.
So the brain seems to be organized in a way that supports the idea of modularity.
It does seem that way, at least for certain cognitive functions. Okay, we've got one last feature on Fodor's list. This one's about development.
All right, bring it on. How does development play into the modularity story?
Well, Fodor proposed that modules have a characteristic ontogenetic pace and sequencing.
Ontogenetic. Wow, throwing some fancy words around there. Break that down for us.
Basically, it means that modules develop according to a specific innate timetable. They unfold in a predictable sequence, kind of like the stages of language acquisition in children.
So they're not learned from scratch, but rather they mature according to some internal schedule. Maybe triggered by environmental input, but still driven by the genes.
Exactly. So those are the 9 features that Fodor laid out. Quite the list, huh?
It is quite a list, but I'm starting to see how they all fit together. You mentioned earlier that informational encapsulation and limited central accessibility are closely related. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. Remember how we talked about encapsulation preventing a module from accessing information from elsewhere in the mind?
Yeah, it's like a little walled garden of processing.
Right. Well, limited central accessibility is kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah.
It means that we, as conscious agents, can't peek inside the module to see what it's doing.
So the module is both protected from outside influences and its inner workings are hidden from our conscious awareness.
Exactly. There are 2 different perspectives on the same basic idea, the isolation of the module.
Okay, I see the connection now. And, it makes me think back to the Muller-Lyer illusion again. Well, it seems like a perfect illustration of this idea. Even when I know the lines are the same length, my visual system just refuses to see them that way. It's like my conscious knowledge can't penetrate that encapsulated processing.
Yeah, that's a classic example of cognitive impenetrability. And that's a term coined by Zenon Pilishin, who actually saw this lack of penetrability as the real litmus test for modularity.
So for Polition, if a system can be influenced by my beliefs or desires, it's not truly modular.
That's right. He was really focused on this idea of cognitive impenetrability, which is actually a kind of more specific version of informational encapsulation.
In what sense?
Well, it specifically refers to the inability of beliefs, desires, and other central cognitive states to influence the operation of a module.
So general encapsulation is about any kind of information being blocked, but cognitive impenetrability is specifically about the influence of our thoughts and motivations.
Exactly. And it's important to note that Fodor actually saw these 2 as closely linked. He thought that a system that was encapsulated in a general sense was also likely to be cognitively impenetrable.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got encapsulation and impenetrability. Are there any other connections between these Fodorian features?
Well, Fodor also argued that features like mandatoriness, speed, and shallowness were likely consequences of, or at least highly correlated with, informational encapsulation.
I can see how that would make sense. If a module has a very limited set of information to work with and is protected from outside interference, it can probably do its thing pretty quickly and efficiently.
Exactly. It doesn't have to waste time and resources searching through a bunch of irrelevant information or figuring out how to reconcile conflicting inputs.
So encapsulation leads to speed, efficiency, and relatively simple outputs.
That's the general idea. Okay, so I think we've got a pretty good handle on Fodor's concept of a mental module now, but we should probably clarify that he didn't think the entire mind was modular, right?
That's right. He was famous for his modest modularity hypothesis.
Exactly. So what did he mean by that? Well, his positive claim was that input systems, which includes perception and language, are modular.
Okay, so the systems responsible for taking in information from the world are modular.
Right. But his negative claim was that central systems, the ones involved in things like belief fixation, reasoning, planning, all the higher level stuff, are not modular.
So he drew a sharp distinction between the systems that interface with the world and the systems that do the heavy lifting of thinking.
Exactly. And he had some pretty good reasons for drawing that distinction. He defined input systems as the mechanisms that take the raw sensory data from our transducers, eyes, ears, and so on. And their job is to basically present the world to thought.
They're like the interface between the physical world and our internal mental world.
Precisely. And he argued that these input systems form a natural kind, a scientifically meaningful category, precisely because they share these modular properties, especially informational encapsulation.
So, for Fodor, the modularity of input systems wasn't just a random fact, it was a reflection of some deeper principle of cognitive organization.
Right. He thought there were good reasons why these systems had to be modular, reasons that had to do with the nature of perception and the demands of interacting with the world.
Okay, that's really interesting. But even this more limited claim about the modularity of input systems has been challenged, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's been a lot of debate about whether even perception and language are as strictly modular as Fodor thought, especially when it comes to that key feature of informational encapsulation.
So, what kind of evidence have people brought forward to challenge this view?
Well, one major line of argument comes from cross-modal effects. This is where information from different senses seems to influence each other, even at pretty early stages of processing.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
The McGurk effect is a classic one.
Hmm.
This is where what you see someone's lips doing influences what you hear them saying.
Oh, yeah, that one's so weird. Like if you see someone saying, ga, but here, booba, your brain sort of blends them together into da.
Exactly. And this raises a real problem for strict modularity. If auditory speech perception is supposed to be encapsulated, how come visual information about lip movements is messing with what we hear?
It does seem to suggest that there's more communication going on between the senses than a strict modular view would allow.
That's the challenge.
Hmm.
And it gets even trickier with illusions like the double flash illusion.
What's that one?
It's where you see a single flash of light, but hear two beeps. And many people will report seeing two flashes even though there was only one.
So the auditory information is influencing the visual experience.
Yeah, and that's really hard to explain if our visual system is supposed to be completely sealed off from other sources of information.
Right. These cross-modal effects suggest that our senses are more interconnected than we might have thought.
That's the argument. Okay, so that's one challenge to low-level modularity. Another one comes from top-down effects.
Top-down. So we're talking about how our knowledge, beliefs, and expectations can influence what we perceive.
Exactly. And one of the most famous examples of this is the phone restoration effect.
Fill me in. What's that?
Okay, so imagine you hear a sentence, but one of the sounds is replaced by a cough or a noise. Something like, the eel is on the axle.
I see. So there's a missing sound.
Right. But what's interesting is that people often report hearing the missing sound, even though it was never actually there. And the sound they hear is heavily influenced by the context.
Ah, so if I heard the eel is on the orange, I might hear a different sound for that missing foam.
Exactly. Your brain is filling in the gap based on what makes sense in the context. And this seems to involve accessing your knowledge about words and meanings, which is a problem for encapsulation.
Right. If the language module is supposed to be working in isolation, it shouldn't be able to use that kind of knowledge.
Precisely. And there are other top-down effects that challenge modularity, like studies that suggest our desires can influence how close objects appear, or that racial categories can affect how we perceive skin tone.
That's really interesting. It's like our minds are constantly shaping our experience of the world, even at the most basic perceptual levels.
Yeah, it's a very active debate in cognitive science right now, trying to figure out how much influence our thoughts and beliefs have on our senses.
Okay, so we've got cross-modal effects and top-down effects challenging encapsulation. What else?
Well, there's also evidence that our perceptual systems are not as fixed and unchanging as Fodor thought. There's a lot of evidence for what's called diachronic penetrability.
Diachronic. Okay, another fancy word. What does that mean?
It basically means changing over time. So diachronic penetrability refers to the idea that our experiences throughout our lives can actually change how our perceptual systems work.
So it's not just that our beliefs and desires can influence perception in the moment, but our past experiences can actually reshape the very way we see and hear the world.
Exactly. And one example of this is the Muller-Lyer illusion again.
Oh, that illusion keeps coming back.
I know, it's a good one. But what's interesting is that the strength of the illusion actually varies across cultures and age groups.
So people who grow up in different environments with different visual experiences might actually perceive the illusion differently.
Yeah, that's the suggestion. And that's tough to reconcile with the idea of a completely hardwired, encapsulated visual module.
Right, it seems like experience is playing a role in shaping our perceptual systems.
It does seem that way, although defenders of modularity could argue that this variability is due to something called diachronic modularity.
Okay, another diachronic term. What's the difference?
Well, diachronic modularity basically says that the basic modular structure of the mind is innate, but the specific parameters can be adjusted by experience.
So the hardware is fixed, but the software can be tweaked.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Like, we're all born with the capacity for language, but the specific language we learn depends on our environment.
I see. So the basic modular architecture is there, but it gets fine-tuned over time based on our experiences.
Precisely. Okay, we've got one more big challenge to Fodorian modularity to cover. This one comes from neuroscience.
Oh, the brain stuff. I knew we couldn't escape it forever.
Nope, can't get away from the brain. So what's the problem for modularity? Well, as we've been learning more about the brain, it's become clear that the picture is a lot messier than Fodor might have hoped.
In what sense?
Well, instead of finding neat one-to-one mappings between modules and brain areas, like Fodor predicted, we often see evidence of what's called neural reuse.
Neural reuse. So the same brain areas are involved in multiple different functions.
Exactly. Like, for example, the fusiform face area, which is thought to be specialized for face recognition, also shows activity when people are recognizing objects within their area of expertise.
So car experts might use the same brain area for recognizing cars as they do for recognizing faces.
Yeah, that's the idea. And this pattern of neural reuse seems to be pretty common throughout the brain.
So instead of having these dedicated encapsulated modules, it seems like cognitive functions are more distributed, implemented in these complex networks of interacting brain regions.
That's the emerging picture. And it makes it a lot harder to argue for the kind of strict modularity that Fodor had in mind.
Right. It's like the brain is more of a tangled web than a neatly organized filing cabinet.
Exactly. So those are some of the main challenges to even the modest modularity that Fodor proposed.
Wow, that's a lot to digest.
Why?
But I guess that's philosophy for you, always questioning our assumptions and pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
Absolutely. And now that we've thoroughly explored the challenges to low-level modularity, maybe we should shift gears and talk about Fodor's arguments against high-level modularity.
Yeah, good idea. He famously claimed that central processes like reasoning and belief formation couldn't be modular. So why did he think that?
Well, his argument hinges on two key properties that he thought characterized central systems: isotropy and being Quinian.
Okay, two new terms for our philosophical vocabulary. Let's start with isotropy. What did he mean by that?
In this context, isotropy refers to the interconnectedness of our beliefs. It's the idea that, in principle, any piece of information we have could potentially be relevant to figuring out what else we should believe.
So, like, my knowledge of botany could somehow be relevant to my beliefs about astronomy, even though they seem like totally different fields.
Exactly. Fodor famously said, in principle, our botany constrains our astronomy, if only we could think of ways to make them connect.
That's a pretty wild idea. So he's saying that our entire belief system is this massively interconnected web where every node is potentially connected to every other node.
That's the basic idea, and it's a pretty holistic view of how our beliefs work.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp the concept of isotropy, but what about this Quinian business? What's that all about?
Well, to say that a process is Quinian means that the way we confirm or disconfirm beliefs is sensitive to global properties of our entire belief system. So it's not just about looking at the evidence for a particular belief in isolation.
So we're taking into account how well the new belief fits with everything else we believe.
Exactly. It's about things like simplicity, plausibility, and conservatism. Does the new belief make our overall set of beliefs simpler, more coherent, more consistent with what we already hold to be true?
So it's kind of a holistic evaluation process. We're judging a belief not just on its own merits, but on how well it plays with the rest of our cognitive team.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've got these two properties of central systems, isotropy and being Quinian. How do they lead to Fodor's rejection of high-level modularity?
Well, his argument is that both of these properties are incompatible with informational encapsulation.
Let me see if I can follow the logic. If our beliefs are all interconnected, and if the way we confirm beliefs depends on the whole system, then the processes involved must have access to a lot of information, right?
Precisely. And that means they can't be encapsulated. They can't be working in these little isolated modules.
Ah, I see. Encapsulation would prevent them from accessing all the information they need to do their job.
Exactly. And this led to Fodor's famous, or perhaps infamous, first law of the nonexistence of cognitive science.
That sounds ominous. What does that law say?
It basically states that the more global a cognitive process is, the less likely we are to be able to understand it scientifically.
So he was basically saying that the most interesting parts of the mind, the ones that deal with things like reasoning and belief formation, might be beyond the reach of science.
That was his worry, yeah. And it stemmed from his belief that these global systems are unlikely to have a neat, localized brain architecture.
So if everything is connected to everything else, there's no hope of finding these specialized modules in the brain.
That's what he thought. And he also argued that these global processes are inherently resistant to the kind of computational explanations that were popular in cognitive science at the time.
Why is that?
Well, he thought that good science often works by breaking complex systems down into simpler, isolable components. You study the parts in isolation, and then you figure out how they interact to produce the behavior of the whole system.
And modules with their encapsulation fit that model perfectly.
Exactly. But Fodor argued that Quinian and isotropic systems, because they're so interconnected, they defy this kind of decomposition.
So you can't study them piecemeal because the parts are too intertwined.
That was his concern. And it led to a kind of pessimism about our ability to understand these higher-level aspects of the mind.
So for Fodor, modularity was both a descriptive claim about how the mind is organized and a kind of methodological constraint on cognitive science.
That's a great way to put it. But of course, as with most things in philosophy, not everyone agreed with his pessimistic conclusions.
Right, because if there's one thing philosophers are good at, it's challenging each other's ideas.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there have been a number of attempts to challenge Fodor's argument against high-level modularity.
Okay, give us the rundown. What are the main strategies people have used to push back against Fodor's view?
Well, there are three main lines of attack, as laid out in that Stanford Encyclopedia entry you mentioned. Some people have argued that central processes aren't actually as global as Fodor claimed. They've tried to show that there might be more local structure to reasoning and belief formation than he allowed.
So maybe not everything is connected to everything else after all.
Right. Others have argued that globality and encapsulation aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Maybe there are ways for a system to be both globally sensitive and informationally encapsulated.
So maybe you can have your cake and eat it too.
Potentially. But the third strategy, and the one that's had the most influence, is to argue that encapsulation isn't actually essential for modularity.
Okay, so this is basically saying that you can have modules without that strict Fodorian isolation.
Exactly. And this line of thinking has led to the development of what's called the massive modularity hypothesis.
Massive modularity. That sounds pretty ambitious.
It is. It's a pretty radical departure from Fodor's modest modularity.
So what's the basic idea?
The massive modularity hypothesis claims that the mind is modular through and through. It's not just the input systems that are modular, but pretty much everything, including those higher-level cognitive functions that Fodor thought were non-modular.
So the mind is just modules all the way down?
That's the claim. And this view has been championed by a lot of evolutionary psychologists, people like Lida Cosmides, John Tooby, Steven Pinker.
Big names in the field.
Yeah, heavy hitters. And the philosopher Peter Carruthers has also been a major proponent of massive modularity.
Okay, so they're all on board with this idea, but if they're saying that the whole mind is modular, their conception of what a module is must be pretty different from Fodor's, right?
You're absolutely right. Carruthers himself admits that if massive modularity is going to be even remotely plausible, then we have to loosen up the definition of module quite a bit.
So which of those Fodorian features do they ditch?
Well, they pretty much give up on the idea of narrow scope encapsulation.
That was Fodor's big thing, though.
I know, but they argue that it's just too restrictive. They also downplay the importance of things like proprietary transducers, shallow outputs, fast processing, and strong innateness.
So they're stripping away a lot of the original features. What's left? What makes a module in this new view?
Well, for them, a module is basically any functionally specialized processing system that might be associated with a particular brain area and whose internal workings are opaque to consciousness.
So it's more about functional specialization than anything else.
That's a big part of it, yeah. And they don't necessarily require modules to be domain-specific in the strict Fodorian sense.
So a module could process information from multiple domains.
Potentially, yeah. And they don't require modules to be completely automatic either. There might be some degree of conscious control involved.
Okay, so it's a much looser, more flexible conception of modularity.
Exactly. And this makes the idea of massive modularity a lot more plausible, but it also makes it harder to test empirically.